The cruelest lies never come from enemies. They are spoken through the smiles of those who stood by my side. When they ruthlessly strip away my life and stand arrogantly at the peak of their triumph, they forget one basic rule of survival. The quietest ones hold the perfect blueprints for destruction. Never trust a flawless family flaunted under ballroom lights. The supposed victor is often the most naive prey in a scam worth millions of dollars. Hello, wonderful listeners of Vivian Revenge Stories, and thank you so much for tuning in today. Unfortunately, our channel has recently been demonetized by YouTube, meaning we currently have absolutely zero budget to keep our operations running. If you find today's story captivating, we would be incredibly grateful if you could support us with just $1. This small act will give us the funds to pay our hardworking staff, help them cover their daily living expenses, and allow us to continue creating these stories for you to enjoy. You can easily donate by scanning the PayPal QR code currently on your screen, or by clicking the PayPal link located in the description or the comments section of this video. My name is Autumn Weaver, and this is the blueprint of my revenge. The air inside the grand ballroom of downtown Seattle was thick with the suffocating scent of expensive perfume, aged champagne, and hollow promises. It was exactly the kind of high society charity gala designed to make the elite feel generous, while they quietly sized up each other's net worth. Overhead, a massive crystal chandelier cast fragmented, blinding light across the marble floor, illuminating the artificial smiles of the city's wealthiest patrons. As a 38-year-old chief architect at the Ethereal Dynamics Syndicate, my mind naturally dissects structures. I spend my days looking for load-bearing walls, analyzing foundations, and identifying hidden stress fractures that could bring a towering skyscraper to its knees. Tonight, I applied that very same analytical gaze to the people around me. I stood near a towering marble column, my posture perfectly straight, letting the ambient noise wash over me. That was when the flawless facade of the evening cracked. It had been exactly 1 year since the ink dried on my divorce papers. I had spent 12 agonizing months rebuilding my life from the rubble, brick by brick. And now, walking through the gilded double doors, was the architect of my previous misery. Julian, my ex-husband, strode into the room radiating a sickening level of unearned arrogance. His tailored tuxedo fit him perfectly, but it was the accessory on his arm that truly completed his ensemble of betrayal. Sienna. She was the woman I had once called my best friend, the confidant who had dried my tears during the darkest nights of my marriage, only to be the very one sneaking into my bed when I was not looking. Now, she wore a blindingly expensive emerald silk dress, clutching Julian with one hand. In her other arm, resting against her chest like the ultimate trophy of their deceit, was a plump, 1-year-old baby boy, the supposed heir. They spotted me almost immediately. I did not avert my gaze, nor did I retreat into the shadows. I held my ground, my face an unreadable mask of cool indifference. Julian, however, could never resist an audience. He steered Sienna directly toward me, parting the sea of wealthy guests until we formed a tense triangle under the glaring lights. He did not offer a polite greeting. He went straight for the throat, raising his voice just enough to ensure the surrounding circle of socialites could hear every single word. "Well, if it isn't the cold, empty house I used to inhabit," Julian's voice boomed, dripping with cruel satisfaction. He gestured grandly toward the child in Sienna's arms. "Look at us, Autumn. Just look at what a real family looks like, leaving a defective woman who could not even fulfill her basic biological duty. And give me a proper heir was without a doubt the single greatest decision of my entire life. You should be thanking me. At least now you can focus entirely on your little blueprints." Gasps rippled through the nearby eavesdroppers. They waited for me to shatter. They expected the stereotypical reaction of a scorned woman: tears, a slapped cheek, a dramatic exit. Instead, I took a slow, deliberate sip of my champagne. The liquid was cold, but the ice in my veins was colder. I let the silence stretch, forcing him to stew in the awkward, heavy atmosphere he had just created. I looked at him not with anger, but with profound pity, which I knew would infuriate his fragile ego far more than any screaming match. When I finally spoke, my voice was even, polished, and deadly quiet. You always did love the sound of your own voice, Julian. It is a shame your foundation is as hollow as your words. His face flushed a deep crimson, his jaw clenching as his grand moment of humiliation backfired against my impenetrable composure. But I was no longer paying attention to his bruised pride. My architectural instincts had shifted entirely to Sienna. While Julian was busy performing for the crowd, I was mapping out the structural integrity of his new wife. And I noticed something deeply wrong. Sienna was not glowing with the triumphant joy of a victorious woman. Despite her heavy, flawless makeup, the skin around her eyes was taut with an unnatural strain. Her breathing was shallow, erratic, but the most glaring flaw in her structural design was her right hand. The hand resting on Julian's forearm was trembling so violently that the diamonds on her tennis bracelet were clicking audibly against each other. I followed her line of sight, tracing her panicked gaze past Julian's shoulder and into the moving crowd. A waiter in a crisp white uniform was gliding silently through the edge of the ballroom, carrying a silver tray. He was a tall, unremarkable man, yet the moment Sienna's eyes locked onto his profile, her breath hitched loudly. For a fraction of a second, the mask of the loving wife dissolved, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated terror. Her fingers dug into Julian's jacket with desperate, fearful force, pulling the expensive fabric tight. She was not looking at a stranger. She was looking at a ghost. Before I could process the sudden shift in the room's dynamic, a sharp vibration against my hip broke my concentration. I smoothly retrieved my phone from my clutch, keeping the screen shielded from Julian's view. It was an encrypted, urgent text message from Elias, a trusted friend and a ruthless investigative auditor I had hired months ago to dig into the past. The message glowing on the screen contained exactly 2 sentences, but they were enough to ignite the spark that would soon burn Julian's entire empire to the ground. Leave the party now. His family trust files are forged. Rain hammered against the windshield of my car in relentless, rhythmic sheets, blurring the glowing streetlights of the Seattle skyline into jagged streaks of gold and crimson. It had been exactly 45 minutes since I walked out of that suffocating ballroom. I drove toward the desolate outskirts of the city, where the glittering high-rises gave way to forgotten industrial parks and empty lots. I pulled into the muddy parking area of a 24-hour diner. Its neon sign buzzed aggressively, half the letters burnt out, casting a sickly red glow over the wet pavement. Inside, the diner smelled of stale coffee, cheap disinfectant, and damp wool. The place was entirely deserted, save for a tired waitress dozing behind the counter and the man sitting in the furthest corner booth. Elias. Elias was not the kind of auditor who worked in a glass-paneled office. He was a financial ghost, a man who specialized in unearthing the filthy secrets buried beneath immaculate corporate ledgers. He sat with his back to the wall, nursing a mug of black coffee, a thick, unlabeled manila folder resting squarely beneath his folded hands. I slid into the vinyl booth opposite him, the cold from the rain still clinging to my trench coat. He did not bother with pleasantries. He knew my time, like my patience, was entirely exhausted. "You look remarkably composed for a woman who just stood in the same room as her executioners," Elias murmured, his voice barely rising above the low hum of the diner's ventilation system. I unbuttoned my coat and leaned forward. "They did not execute me, Elias. They only knocked down an old facade. Now, show me the structural damage you found." Elias offered a grim, razor-thin smile. He opened the folder, revealing stacks of bank statements, encrypted emails, and heavily redacted legal contracts. He tapped a finger against a thick document bearing the official seal of Julian's aristocratic family. "Let us start with the foundation," Elias said, his eyes locking onto mine. "Your ex-husband did not experience a sudden, overwhelming crisis of the heart. He experienced a catastrophic financial deadline. You remember the old patriarch's will? The ironclad trust fund?" I nodded slowly. Julian's grandfather was a ruthless tycoon who despised weakness and tied his vast fortune to archaic, draconian conditions. "Look at clause section 4, paragraph 2, Elias instructed. I pulled the page closer. The legal jargon was dense, but the stipulation was terrifyingly clear. Julian had to produce a legitimate male heir before his 40th birthday. If he failed to secure the bloodline by that exact date, his entire access to the family trust fund, an astronomical sum of over $85 million, would be irrevocably dissolved and instantly distributed to his waiting cousins. I felt the breath catch in my throat as the cold, hard mathematics of betrayal clicked into place. "Julian was 38 when he started acting distant," I whispered, the realization washing over me like a wave of ice water. "He was 39 when he filed the divorce papers. I was not just a disappointment to his ego, I was a literal obstacle standing between him and his fortune." Elias nodded, sliding a second stack of papers across the scratched Formica table. "Exactly. He needed a son, fast. And your dear friend Sienna was more than willing to provide the golden ticket. But here is where the architecture of their little romance begins to rot." Elias began tracing lines of highlighted text with his pen, moving with rapid clinical precision. Once the child was born, and Julian's position as the primary beneficiary was temporarily secured, the money started flowing. But it is not staying in Julian's accounts. Over the past 8 months, millions of dollars have been systematically bled from his personal portfolios. $3 million here, $4.5 million there. It is being routed through an incredibly complex labyrinth of shell corporations in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus. It is a brilliant textbook money laundering operation. I stared at the dizzying array of offshore routing numbers. "Where is it landing, Elias?" I asked, my voice tightening. Elias flipped to the final page. "A secure, untraceable, offshore trust account, solely owned and operated by Sienna." A chill ran down my spine. Sienna was quietly siphoning Julian's inherited wealth right from under his arrogant nose. But Elias was not finished. The true devastating blow was yet to come. "But she is not the only signature on the master account," Elias said softly, his tone shifting into something distinctly dangerous. "Look at the secondary beneficiary authorized to withdraw funds." I looked down at the highlighted name at the bottom of the page. Roman Hayes. The diner seemed to spin for a fraction of a second. The name hit me like a physical strike to the chest. Roman Hayes. Sienna's volatile, fiercely independent college boyfriend. The man who supposedly drove his motorcycle off a treacherous coastal cliff 7 years ago. They never found a body, only a charred wreck washed up on the rocks. But everyone, including the police, had declared him legally dead. "That is impossible," I breathed out, my mind racing at a frantic pace. "Roman is dead. I attended the memorial service. I held Sienna while she wept over an empty casket." Elias leaned back in his booth, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "Paper trails do not mourn, Autumn, and dead men do not open offshore bank accounts in the Cayman Islands." Suddenly, the heavy, suffocating air of the gala rushed back into my memory. The clinking of crystal, the blinding lights, and Sienna, her face pale, her breathing erratic, her manicured fingers gripping Julian's jacket in absolute terror as she stared across the ballroom. She had not been looking at a random waiter. She had been looking at a ghost who refused to stay buried. The unremarkable man in the crisp white uniform carrying the silver tray. The profile. The height. It was him. Roman Hayes was alive. He was breathing. He was in Seattle, and he was watching them. The sheer scale of the deception unfolded before my eyes like a massive, terrifying blueprint. This was never a pathetic, cliché story of a husband having a midlife crisis and running off with a best friend. It was a heist, a meticulously engineered, long-con fraud designed to drain an $85 million empire. Julian thought he had won the ultimate prize. He thought he had outsmarted me, secured his legacy, and paraded his perfect new family for the world to envy. But he was nothing more than a blinded, arrogant fool trapped inside a burning building, completely unaware that the woman sleeping next to him was the one holding the matches. Sienna and Roman were playing a high-stakes game of survival and greed, and Julian was bleeding out financially with every passing second. I looked at the documents, feeling a dangerous, electrifying sense of clarity wash over my mind. They had stolen my life to build their fortune. Now, I was going to study their fragile, crooked foundation, and I was going to tear the entire structure down to the dirt. The corporate servers at the Ethereal Dynamics Syndicate were a sprawling digital labyrinth of zoning permits, offshore escrow accounts, and highly classified architectural schematics. I sat entirely alone in my corner office, the harsh synthetic glow of the dual monitors reflecting off the floor-to-ceiling glass walls that overlooked the gray, rain-soaked Seattle morning. It was exactly 6:30 in the morning. Using an executive override code I had acquired years ago, I bypassed the standard corporate firewall and began cross-referencing the obscure shell company names Elias had provided with our regional real estate acquisitions database. It took 2 grueling hours of scrolling through endless, mind-numbing digital records before I finally found the anomaly. It was a secluded, fortress-like estate nestled deep within the dense pine forests of Mercer Island. The property had been purchased exactly 4 months ago for $7,500,000, paid entirely in cash. The buyer of record was a shadow holding company registered in Cyprus, but the signature authorizing the structural renovation permits belonged unmistakably to Sienna. She was not just quietly siphoning funds from Julian's accounts. She was actively building a fortified safe house, a hidden sanctuary to retreat to when their fragile house of cards inevitably collapsed under its own weight. My desk phone rang suddenly, the sharp sound shattering the quiet concentration of my office. I fully expected to hear the voice of a junior architect calling about a delayed blueprint. Instead, the voice on the other end of the secure line was breathy, fragile, and laced with an artificial tremor that immediately made my stomach turn. It was Sienna. She begged for just 45 minutes of my time. She claimed the heavy burden of guilt was eating her alive, that seeing my face at the charity gala had awakened a desperate, burning need to apologize to me, to somehow make amends for the total destruction of my marriage. I knew exactly what this pathetic display was. It was a calculated reconnaissance mission. She was utterly terrified of the knowing, piercing way I had looked at her the previous night. She desperately needed to know if I had noticed the mysterious waiter in the ballroom. She needed to probe the depths of my ignorance regarding the financial investigation. I coldly agreed to meet her at exactly 12 o'clock noon at a minimalist, aggressively expensive Japanese tea house downtown. It was a prestigious location where the austere acoustics demanded hushed voices, and dramatic emotional outbursts were strictly forbidden by the rigid social code. Sienna arrived exactly 10 minutes late, employing a classic manipulative power play masked as frantic, charming disorganization. She slid nervously into the private wooden booth across from me, hastily shedding a heavy designer trench coat. To the untrained eye of a stranger, she looked like a tragic, beautiful heroine torn apart by love. But under the clinical, merciless lighting of the tea house, I could easily read the catastrophic structural failures in her posture. Her foundation was severely cracking. The heavy, expertly applied layer of matte foundation could not hide the dark, bruised exhaustion settling deep under her eyes. Her collarbone was sharp and protruding, indicating rapid, unhealthy weight loss. When she reached across the table for the delicate porcelain teapot, her fingers were rigid and uncoordinated. We engaged in a sickening, protracted game of verbal chess for 20 agonizing minutes. She offered tearful, meticulously rehearsed apologies about the unstoppable force of destiny and the tragic inevitability of true love. I gave her absolutely nothing in return but polite, icy nods and silent stares. Deeply frustrated by my impenetrable exterior, she finally steered the conversation awkwardly toward the charity gala, casually and clumsily fishing to see if I had noticed anything unusual or anyone out of place among the catering staff. I let her dangle in the uncomfortable, suffocating silence for a long, torturous moment. I took a very slow, deliberate sip of my green tea, savoring the bitter, earthy taste on my tongue. I looked directly into her bloodshot, panic-stricken eyes and decided it was the perfect time to detonate the explosive charge. "You know, Sienna," I began, my voice a soothing, conversational whisper that masked the lethal intent behind my words. "The charity gala last night was utterly fascinating. The floral arrangements were exquisite, and the ambiance was lovely. But I was particularly impressed by the sheer professionalism of the catering staff, especially the tall waiter serving champagne near the East Marble column. He had such a distinctive, intense energy about him. I believe his name was Roman Hayes. It is such a small world, is it not?" The physical reaction was instantaneous and utterly catastrophic. Sienna's right hand spasmed violently. The delicate porcelain teacup slipped from her weak grip, hitting the solid oak table and shattering loudly into dozens of jagged, sharp pieces. Hot, scalding tea spilled rapidly across the polished wood, dripping relentlessly onto her expensive silk skirt. But she did not even flinch at the burning sensation. The blood drained completely from her face in a matter of seconds, leaving her looking exactly like a freshly exhumed corpse. Her jaw trembled so violently, her teeth clicked together. She desperately tried to speak, to form a coherent denial, but only a choked, ragged gasp escaped her constricted throat. In that singular, beautiful moment of absolute paralyzing terror, her meticulously crafted mask of the victorious, happy wife completely disintegrated. She leaned forward over the ruined table, her chest heaving with panic, and whispered frantically. She begged me to tell her what he had said to me, demanding to know if he was watching us right now from the street outside. The terrifying truth spilled from her trembling lips before she could stop herself. She was not the brilliant mastermind playing a flawless game of deception. She was a terrified hostage. Roman was not just a silent, supportive partner in their multi-million-dollar fraud. He was an unpredictable, violent apex predator, and he was holding her on a very short, very dangerous leash, threatening to expose everything if she did not funnel the money exactly as he commanded. I leaned back comfortably against the plush leather booth, silently watching the frantic, pathetic creature across from me desperately dabbing at the spilled tea with trembling paper napkins. She was completely broken, hopelessly caught between the impending wrath of Julian's billionaire family and the lethal, suffocating threats of her phantom lover. For 12 grueling months, I had allowed myself to believe I was the tragic victim of their cruel narrative. I had let them cast me as the discarded, inadequate wife. But sitting in that quiet, elegant room, feeling the absolute panic radiating from the woman who had stolen my life, the power dynamic shifted with the unstoppable force of a tectonic plate. I held all the master blueprints now. I knew every hidden flaw, every toxic secret, and every structural vulnerability of their fraudulent lives. I realized then that I held the detonator to their existence. I was no longer a passive spectator in the tragedy of my own life. I was the master architect of their impending ruin, and I was going to ensure that when the roof finally caved in, it would crush them both into dust. It was exactly 2 o'clock in the morning when the encrypted email from Elias arrived in my secure inbox. The subject line was completely blank, but the attachment was heavily fortified behind 3 layers of military-grade password protection. I sat in the dim light of my living room, the rain from the previous days having finally stopped, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence over the sleeping city. I carefully typed in the complex decryption key Elias had provided over a secure phone line earlier that evening. A digitized document materialized on my screen, bearing the discreet, elegant logo of a highly exclusive private fertility clinic located in Geneva, Switzerland. Elias had spent the last 48 hours systematically dismantling their firewalled digital archives. What he found inside was not just a smoking gun. It was the nuclear code to Julian's entire existence. I scrolled past the dense medical jargon, my eyes scanning the heavily redacted patient history until I reached the final laboratory analysis. The patient name was Julian. The date of the clinical examination was exactly 5 years ago, during the very lowest, most agonizing point of our marriage. The medical conclusion was written in cold, clinical, unforgiving ink. Congenital sterility, a complete, irreversible genetic inability to reproduce. The probability of him ever fathering a child organically was exactly 0%. My breath hitched, and a wave of absolute blinding fury washed over me, so potent it made my fingers tremble against the keyboard. For 5 agonizing years, Julian had watched me endure invasive tests, painful hormone injections, and the crushing, suffocating weight of perceived inadequacy. I remembered the cold, sterile walls of the hospital waiting rooms I had sat in alone, while he claimed he had urgent corporate board meetings. I remembered the heavy, sympathetic glances from his aristocratic mother, glances he actively encouraged with his dramatic, sorrowful sighs. He had looked me directly in the eyes and blamed my demanding career as a chief architect for our empty nursery. He had orchestrated a masterful, cruel campaign of psychological gaslighting, sacrificing my sanity and my professional reputation on the altar of his fragile, toxic masculinity. He knew the absolute truth the entire time. He was the barren soil, yet he successfully convinced the entire world that I was the one incapable of blooming. But the shocking revelations spawned a terrifying paradox. If Julian was completely sterile, who did the child at the charity gala belong to? The answer struck me with the force of a physical blow, tying every loose thread into a perfectly symmetrical, horrifying knot of deception. Sienna knew. As my former closest confidant, she had intimate access to my deepest insecurities, but she also knew the exact timeline of Julian's sudden, defensive behavioral shifts. She had figured out his ultimate secret, and instead of exposing him, she aggressively weaponized it. She and Roman Hayes had carefully engineered the ultimate illusion. The healthy, plump, 1-year-old boy I had seen resting against Sienna's emerald silk dress under the ballroom chandelier was not a medical miracle. He was Roman's biological son. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of the scheme was darkly cinematic. Julian, acting out of sheer desperation to meet the draconian conditions of his family inheritance before his 40th birthday, was willing to believe any lie that stroked his monumental ego. Sienna simply provided him with the grand narrative he was most desperate to hear. She presented him with a child, stroked his vanity, and let him proudly claim the victory of fatherhood. In return, Julian unknowingly unlocked the $85 million trust fund and handed the financial keys directly to the very people plotting his utter demise. The boy himself was perfectly safe, wrapped in designer fabrics and pampered by an army of expensive nannies. He was not physically abused, but he was something far more cynical. He was a living, breathing Trojan horse, completely unaware that his very existence was the central pillar of a massive, multi-million-dollar financial fraud. I closed the laptop, the glowing screen going completely black, leaving me alone with the reflection of my own tired but fiercely awake eyes in the glass monitor. I was standing at the edge of a massive moral precipice. If I did absolutely nothing, the natural architecture of this disaster would eventually collapse on its own. Roman would drain the offshore accounts, Sienna would flee into the night, and Julian would be left completely bankrupt, humiliated, and utterly destroyed by the very lie he had cultivated. Letting him burn to ash in the fire he had started felt incredibly tempting. It would be profound poetic justice to watch the arrogant billionaire heir lose his entire fortune to a ghost and a traitor. "You are not going to win this," I whispered aloud to the empty room, my voice steady and remarkably cold. As the first gray light of dawn began to creep over the Seattle skyline, casting long, sharp shadows across my living room, I realized that silence was a luxury I could no longer afford. If Julian went down in flames quietly, the false narrative he had spun about me would remain perfectly intact. High society would still remember me as the defective, discarded first wife. They would pity him for being tragically scammed, while my name remained permanently stained by his cruel slander. I vehemently refused to be a pathetic footnote in his tragedy. I did not care about saving his money, and I certainly did not care about saving his soul. I cared about the complete and total demolition of his lies. I was going to expose the locked medical records, the hidden offshore accounts, and the fraudulent bloodline, not to rescue him from the wolves, but to burn his false narrative to the ground. I was going to reclaim my reputation in the most explosive public way possible. The foundation was set. It was time to execute the final blueprints. The 75th floor of the family empire's flagship corporate tower was a masterclass in architectural intimidation. The ceiling was constructed of vaulted tinted glass that allowed the gray, overcast Seattle light to filter in, casting long, sharp shadows across the expansive room. The walls were paneled in rare imported mahogany, and the centerpiece of the space was a massive, custom-built marble conference table that stretched for over 50 feet. It was a room specifically designed to make anyone who entered feel incredibly small, insignificant, and utterly powerless. But as I walked through the heavy double doors at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, I did not feel small. I felt like the only person in the room who truly understood the catastrophic structural failure waiting beneath the polished floors. My presence was perfectly justified by an airtight professional cover. I was officially attending as the senior architectural consultant from the Ethereal Dynamics Syndicate, brought in to briefly present the early-stage expansion blueprints for the family's new commercial real estate district before the main financial proceedings began. It was a flawless, legitimate reason to be sitting quietly in the back row of the most secure, highly anticipated shareholder meeting of the decade. The trap had already been set exactly 3 hours prior. At precisely 6 o'clock in the morning, while Julian was likely admiring his reflection in a custom mirror, a heavily encrypted, unmarked digital dossier had been securely delivered directly to the private, personal server of his eldest sister, Victoria. Victoria was not a woman who cared for dramatic social displays. She was a ruthless, terrifyingly intelligent corporate shark who commanded the true operational power within the family syndicate, silently tolerating her younger brother's flamboyant, arrogant behavior only because of their grandfather's outdated patriarchal traditions. Inside the dossier I sent her was the absolute, undeniable truth. It contained the locked medical records from the private clinic in Geneva, proving Julian's congenital sterility with a 0% chance of biological reproduction. It contained the labyrinth of offshore banking routes, proving that millions of dollars were actively being drained into the Cayman Islands by a phantom named Roman Hayes. And most devastatingly, it contained a certified, legally binding DNA test result. I had acquired a discarded pacifier from the baby during the charity gala, perfectly matching it against a crystal wine glass Julian had left on a cocktail table. The genetic match was absolutely non-existent. Victoria had spent the last 3 hours independently verifying every single document with her own army of private investigators. I knew she would not react with emotional hysterics. She would react with calculated, lethal corporate precision. The boardroom steadily filled with wealthy shareholders, senior board members, and highly paid legal advisors. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of old money and fresh espresso. At exactly 10 o'clock in the morning, the heavy wooden doors swung open, and Julian made his grand, theatrical entrance. He looked incredibly smug, dressed in a custom-tailored navy suit, projecting the absolute pinnacle of unearned confidence. He strode confidently toward the front of the room, carrying the 1-year-old boy in his arms like a priceless golden talisman. The child was dressed in a miniature designer suit, completely oblivious to the fact that he was the central pawn in a multi-million-dollar fraud. Julian was standing at the absolute finish line. Tomorrow was his 40th birthday. Today, he was scheduled to formally sign the final, irrevocable legal documents that would officially transfer the total control of the $85 million family trust fund directly into his personal portfolio. I sat completely motionless in a dark leather chair at the very back of the room, positioned perfectly in the shadows. I picked up a crystal glass of ice water, taking a very slow, deliberate sip. My cold, unblinking gaze bypassed Julian entirely and locked fiercely onto the VIP seating section in the front row. Sienna was sitting there, and she was physically unraveling in real time. She was wearing a stunning pearl-white designer dress, meant to symbolize purity and victory, but she looked as though she was actively suffocating. The suffocating pressure of our previous conversation at the tea house had clearly broken her mental foundation. She was sweating profusely, the heavy layer of expensive makeup melting slightly under the warm glow of the recessed lighting. She was rapidly bouncing her right knee, her knuckles turning bone white as she gripped the armrests of her chair. Every few seconds, she would dart her panicked, bloodshot eyes toward the exit doors, terrified that Roman would suddenly walk in and demand his money, or worse, his son. When she inevitably turned her head and finally noticed me sitting in the back of the room, perfectly calm and holding my glass of water, all the remaining color instantly drained from her face. She stopped breathing. She knew I was the architect of her impending doom, but she was completely paralyzed, utterly trapped under the blinding spotlight of the family she was currently robbing. She was a rat caught inside a perfectly constructed maze, and I was about to close the final door. Julian proudly handed the child to a waiting nanny standing near the podium. He stepped up to the microphone, adjusting his expensive silk tie, completely blind to the agonizing terror consuming his wife just 10 feet away. "Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed board members and family," Julian began, his voice echoing loudly through the state-of-the-art sound system, dripping with an arrogant, unbearable level of self-satisfaction. "Today marks a monumental transition for our legacy. I stand before you not just as your designated leader, but as a proud father. I have fulfilled the sacred mandate set forth by our visionary grandfather. I have secured the future bloodline of this magnificent empire." He paused, waiting for the polite, mandatory applause to ripple through the room. It came, weak but sufficient to inflate his massive ego. He proudly picked up the heavy, solid gold fountain pen resting next to the stack of final trust fund transfer documents. He looked down at the paper that would legally hand him $85 million. He hovered the gold nib exactly 1 inch above the signature line. Before the ink could even touch the pristine parchment, a loud, violent mechanical click echoed through the room. The heavy mahogany doors at the main entrance did not just open, they were forcefully shoved apart. Victoria stepped into the boardroom, wearing a severe charcoal gray business suit. Her face was an absolute mask of terrifying frozen fury. Flanking her on either side were the family's elite chief counsel and 4 heavily armed, broad-shouldered private security contractors dressed entirely in black. Without saying a single word, one of the security contractors quickly turned around and slammed the heavy double doors completely shut, firmly locking the deadbolt with a loud, final echo that sent a shockwave of cold dread through the silent room. Julian froze, the gold pen still hovering foolishly in the air. "Victoria? What exactly is the meaning of this interruption? We are in the middle of the formal signing protocol." Victoria did not answer him. She did not even look at him. She simply raised a small black remote control in her right hand and pressed a single button. Immediately, the massive digital projector screen located directly behind Julian's head went entirely black. The vibrant green charts displaying the third quarter corporate revenue vanished. A second later, the screen flickered aggressively back to life, illuminating the entire front of the room in a harsh, unforgiving white light. Projected in massive, undeniable letters for every single board member, shareholder, and lawyer to read, was the highly classified, locked medical file from the private clinic in Geneva. The words congenital sterility and 0% probability of reproduction glared out like a neon warning sign. A moment later, the screen split in half, the right side suddenly displaying the complex, undeniable web of illegal offshore financial transfers, meticulously highlighting every single stolen million, all funneling directly into a Cayman Islands account registered under the name of Sienna and her dead lover. The storm had officially made landfall, and the structural collapse was absolute. For 3 agonizing seconds, the boardroom was plunged into a vacuum of absolute, deafening silence. The only sound in the vast space was the heavy, solid gold fountain pen slipping from Julian's paralyzed fingers. It struck the polished marble table with a sharp, piercing crack, rolling aimlessly until it fell over the edge and clattered loudly onto the floor. Then, the room completely exploded. The polite, refined atmosphere of the corporate elite shattered into a million jagged pieces of absolute chaos. Senior shareholders began shouting over one another, their faces flushed with outrage and panic. The highly paid legal advisors scrambled aggressively, hastily sweeping the inheritance transfer documents into their leather briefcases, as if the paper itself had suddenly caught fire. At the front of the room, Julian staggered backward, his expensive leather shoes catching on the heavy metal base of the podium. All the blood rushed violently from his face, leaving behind a sickly, translucent pallor. His wide eyes darted frantically across the massive projector screen, reading the cold, clinical proof of his own biological inadequacy, and then shifting to the undeniable ledger of his stolen wealth. The colossal, arrogant ego that had sustained him for nearly 40 years collapsed inward, crushing him under the weight of his own monumental stupidity. He finally realized he was never the grand patriarch he pretended to be. He was nothing more than a pathetic, convenient bank account, gaslighted and betrayed by the very woman he championed. A sudden, piercing shriek cut through the chaotic shouting. Sienna collapsed entirely. She did not fall gracefully. She dropped heavily to her knees on the hard floor, the luxurious pearl-white silk of her designer dress wrinkling violently beneath her. She clutched her head, her perfectly styled hair unraveling into a messy, frantic tangle. She began to sob hysterically, letting out loud, ugly, breathless gasps that echoed off the mahogany walls. But as I watched her from the shadows of the back row, I knew exactly what those tears meant. She was not crying out of regret for deceiving Julian. She was not mourning the end of her marriage. She was weeping for the absolute death of her perfect, multi-million-dollar escape plan. She was mourning the private jets, the designer wardrobes, and the fortified island sanctuary that had just been vaporized into thin air. What Sienna did not know, and what Victoria's meticulous security team had perfectly coordinated, was that the financial bloodletting was simultaneously being stopped at the source. Exactly 75 floors below us, in the vast, echoing lobby of the corporate tower, the final act of their miserable play was unfolding. Roman Hayes had confidently strolled through the revolving glass doors, completely unaware that his digital ghost had finally been given a physical form by federal economic police. He was carrying a heavy leather duffel bag packed with $250,000 in untraceable cash for their final escape. He did not even make it to the street. Plainclothes financial crimes officers intercepted him forcefully, slamming him against the cold marble pillar. The heavy metallic click of steel handcuffs snapping around his wrists echoed through the lobby, permanently anchoring the arrogant thief back to reality. Through the sheer blinding panic of the boardroom, The terrified nanny clutched the crying 1-year-old boy tightly against her chest. I watched as Victoria calmly signaled 2 of her private security contractors to escort the woman and the child safely out of the room through a side door. I felt a brief, quiet wave of relief. The boy was entirely innocent in this massive web of toxic greed. Within 24 hours, the family courts and child protective services would officially intervene, permanently removing him from the radioactive fallout of his parents' crimes. He would be safely placed in the quiet, stable custody of his maternal grandparents, far away from the dark, manipulative calculations that had brought him into the world. I slowly stood up from my leather chair in the back of the room. I picked up my trench coat and draped it neatly over my arm. As the corporate lawyers began aggressively questioning Sienna, and Victoria coldly ordered the building locked down, Julian turned around. Stripped of his fortune, his false legacy, and his pride, he looked desperately into the crowd. His panicked, hollow eyes finally found me standing by the exit. Across 50 feet of absolute ruin, our gazes locked. I saw the desperate, pathetic plea in his expression. He was silently begging for an ally, for someone to tell him this was all just a terrible nightmare, perhaps even begging for my salvation. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply offered him a single, slow, terrifyingly cold nod of acknowledgement. I let him know, in that one silent gesture, that I was the architect of his destruction. Then, I turned my back on him. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors and walked out into the corridor. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of my high heels echoed down the quiet hallway, beating like the steady, triumphant drum of my absolute liberation. Exactly 8 months later, the dust finally settled over the ruins of Julian's life. He was completely bankrupt, facing crippling financial penalties from federal regulators, and had been entirely exiled by his own ruthless family. He had absolutely nothing left but the crushing memory of his own arrogance. I, however, was standing hundreds of feet in the air. I stood on the open-air rooftop terrace of the newest commercial skyscraper I had personally designed for the Ethereal Dynamics Syndicate. The building was a flawless masterpiece of glass and steel, reaching ambitiously toward the clouds. I closed my eyes, breathing in the crisp, fresh Seattle sea breeze. The air felt incredibly clean. The heavy, suffocating weight of the past was completely gone. I opened my eyes, looking out over the endless, glittering horizon, feeling entirely free, unbreakable, and fiercely ready for the brilliant, radiant life waiting for me ahead. Thank you so much from the bottom of my heart, dear listeners, for staying with me until the very end of this journey. Where in the world are you tuning in from today to hear this story? If you enjoyed today's tale of justice, I kindly ask that you help us out with a simple donation of just $1. You can quickly scan the PayPal QR code on your screen, or use the PayPal link provided in the video description or the comments section. Your generous support is the only way our channel can pay our dedicated staff, helping them feed their families and allowing us to continue creating better, more thrilling stories for you. Thank you again, and stay strong.